Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I'm a huge, crazy Star Trek nerd. Today, we are going to look at one of the coolest role playing games in the world, which is Star Trek Adventures, and specifically the Gamma Quadrant supplement for it. We've looked at Alpha, Beta, now we are on to the Gamma Quadrant. This is the one that is on the other side of the Deep Space Nine wormhole, hence DS9 Ops behind me. Um, Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek series by a mile. And a lot of that is because of what they were able to do with the Gamma Quadrant, the Dominion, and all of that kind of stuff. This book gets into a lot of that. Let's say up front, one of the problems, one of the only problems, let's phrase it that way, with this book is that the rules for Vorta and Jem'Hadar characters are actually in the Alpha Quadrant book where it talks about Deep Space Nine. They're not in this book, which is obnoxious. If you want to be playing like a full Dominion War kind of storyline, you're going to want both books anyway because you need both ends of the wormhole. If you just want to tell a story that is about the Gamma Quadrant and everyone on your crew is like in a Dominion ship flying around or something like that, you can't really do that alone. But honestly, this book isn't designed for that anyway. This book, while it claims to be a Gamma Quadrant supplement, is wholly and unabashedly a Dominion War supplement, which is a really cool thing to be because the Dominion are really neat. Anyway, let's get into this and have a look at what's in the PDF. So, um, this is split into sections. See, this is one thing, just as an example of what I'm talking about. The big end paper map that sits at the front is not actually of the Gamma Quadrant. It's of the situation in the Alpha Quadrant during the Dominion War. Um, why is there no map of the Gamma Quadrant? Because I honestly don't think that such a map exists. I've seen some online, and maybe they're just fans related. Maybe they just decided for whatever reason that this was a better idea. Anyway, they have made their choice. This is about the Dominion War. The Gamma Quadrant's a key part of that, but that's not what the supplement is really talking about. So, let's get into this. So, chapter 1 is just, hey, it's we've talked about this before. Chapter 1 of every Star Trek Adventure supplement is somebody walking you through the table of contents so that you know what is in here. Done. So chapter 2 is the Gamma Quadrant, and this is when we're going to talk about the Dominion. The Dominion is fascinating. If you're not the big Deep Space Nine nerd that I am, you might not know a lot about them. They are in many ways the dark reflection of the Federation. And to some extent, the Borg were that as well, right? The Borg were a big, you know, imperialist society that went out and incorporated everybody else. They assimilated every culture they found into themselves and made them all identical, which is what some people claim the Federation is doing. I think the Federation celebrates their diversity a little more than that, but that's kind of what the Borg were intended to be. The Gamma Quadrant, the Dominion, does the same thing, but in a more nuanced way, and with a lot more subtext going on. They are not the single faceless hive mind of the Borg. They are a a vast multicultural society very similar to the Federation, but evil. And this is really interesting because it is a very specific and purposeful contrast to the typical Star Trek bad guy, which is, the Borg are all one thing. The Klingons are all one thing. The Romulans are all one thing. In fact, in a lot of those, I think in all three of those cases, you can say they are one trait that is magnified to an entire cultural level. The Klingons are warlike and concerned with honor. That's kind of all they are. They're a little richer than that, but compare that to the Federation that has this, thousands or at least hundreds of different species and all these things all under one umbrella, and they're trying to work together and they're trying to celebrate their differences, like I said. And a lot of the bad guys start to look very one note. The Dominion is an answer to that. The Dominion does the same thing the Federation does, which it, invites other species, other cultures, other organizations to join them under a single umbrella, very Federation-esque, but instead of being a kind of egalitarian society, it is a theocracy, and a fascist theocracy at that. It is headed up by the founders, which many, though not all, of the members of the Dominion worship as gods and think that they are these incredibly powerful beings that should rule the whole galaxy, and we are so grateful that they've let us be a part of their giant hegemony, and we are going to rule the galaxy with them. Which is not to say that every member of the Dominion is a religious fanatic, because most of them are not. But that is how the whole thing is set up. That's how the organization is set up. And so while they do a very Federation-ish job of collecting other people and uniting them in a single cause, rather than that cause being exploration and empowerment and growth, that cause is imperialism and the glory of the founders. And we're going to control everything rather than we're going to spread out. And a lot of people are going to look at the Federation and say, oh, well, they're after the same thing. They're clearly imperialists. They have colonies everywhere. That's what makes Deep Space Nine so good, is that it wrestles with these questions. And one of the ways it wrestles with them is by showing the Dominion as like an evil reflection of what the Federation could be if it gave in to its worst impulses and if it did all the horrible things that people claim that it already is doing. So, the Dominion are great. Now, let's talk about the different parts of the Dominion. There are lots and lots of different species involved, but it is led by 3 specifically. And I don't know how quickly we get into that. Anyway, we get to talk about them. The Great Link, let's go ahead and talk about the founders right now. The founders are changelings. They are shapeshifters. They're the same species that Odo from Deep Space Nine is. I mean, basically a kind of smooth-featured, kind of looks like a half-formed person when they are in humanoid form. But they can take on any form. They can look exactly like you, or exactly like your friend, or they can look like a mouse, or they can look like a bag, or they can look like anything. And they also can form what's called the Great Link. Their homeworld, which is hidden and nobody knows where it is basically this kind of rock with nothing on it. And then there's just hundreds, thousands, millions of changelings, all kind of turned into this amorphous blob and mingling their thoughts and their consciousness and their physical substance with each other. And that's called the Great Link. And every founder, every changeling is a part of that Great Link, to the extent that only in exceptionally rare cases do they even have individual names. And while they do think of themselves as individuals, they are individuals who are part of the Great Link. It's not the hive mind that the Borg is. They can't actually telepathically communicate with each other unless they're part of that link. Once they leave it, then they, are their own discrete being until they join it again. Anyway, they are fascinating. And because of their ability to hide and to change their form and to disguise themselves, their method of waging war for several seasons of the show, of Deep Space Nine, was a Cold War that was designed to destabilize the Federation and the Klingons and everybody else, the Cardassians, rather than to just conquer them. They tried the destabilization, and that went on for 4 or 5 years, and then they're like, okay, we think we've weakened you enough through infighting and paranoia, and now we're going to pull out the big guns. So, what are the big guns? Well, there are 2. The Vorta and the Jem'Hadar. And these are very much the carrot and the stick of the Dominion. The Vorta are the diplomats of the Dominion. They are the ones who show up to negotiate with you, and they say, hey, would you like to join our society? We have Coca-Cola, and we have pretty girls, and we've got all of these great movies you can watch. Our culture is exciting, and here's the economic benefits of being a part of us, and they're just going to offer you all this stuff. And you're going to lose your freedom, and you're going to lose a lot of your individuality, but you're going to be a part of this bigger, greater, wonderful thing. And if you say yes, then hooray, you're welcome to the Dominion. And if you say no, then it's time for the stick. You didn't take the carrot, you get the stick. The stick are the Jem'Hadar, who are genetically engineered super soldiers who are undyingly devoted to the founders. These are the ones, the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar, who worship them as literal gods, who do everything they say. And in fact, the Jem'Hadar, before they go into battle, one of their typical battle cries is, we are already dead. We are going into battle to earn our right to be alive again. And so if they die in battle, they don't care because they're already dead. It's this very, like I said, theocratic society. So the Jem'Hadar are really neat, and the Vorta are really neat. The Jem'Hadar are controlled by Ketracel White, which is this... it's an enzyme that their body requires to live, but that they cannot synthesize on their own. And so they need regular injections of it, and if they don't get it, they die, and that's part of how their loyalty is assured. And, you know, they can't rebel because if they don't get Ketracel White, they die. Anyway, the book then goes into a lot of other Dominion species and confirms what have been primarily fan theories for a very long time. So, for example, the Dry. There was a very early episode, I want to say it was season 1, but it might have been 2, called The Hunted, and it was about Tosk. If you guys remember Tosk, the Tosk was a species that was designed as really intelligent prey for this other species called the Dry to hunt. There has long been a fan theory, partially confirmed by the creators of the show, that the Jem'Hadar were kind of genetically enhanced versions of the Tosk. Some of their physical features are the same. Some of their basic premises are the same. What this book does is it just goes full bore on that and says the Dry, who created the Tosk, they're this incredible genetic engineering race in addition to being hunters. And they are the ones who joined the Dominion and helped the founders to create the Jem'Hadar and to create the Vorta and to do all these incredible things. And so it really is expanding the lore in a lot of neat ways. The Karema are like the merchant species. They're in some ways the Ferengi of the Gamma Quadrant, but in kind of a very highfalutin, almost Medici kind of way, rather than the little money-grubbing Ferengis who are snarling and trying to get everything. The Dosi, the Yadarans, there's a lot of these. I had to look some of these up. The Dosi actually show up in the very first episode that the Dominion are mentioned in. Quark is trying to figure out who the real power in the Gamma Quadrant is, and so he starts talking to the Dosi, and then he gets passed off to the Karema, and then he gets passed off to the Dominion itself, and it turns out to all be the Nagus was trying to do this because he's so smart, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, lots of different descriptions of these cool aliens, and for almost every one of these, there's going to be player race options later in the book, which is great. It talks about the culture, it talks about the emblem, and this part in particular has got to be an in-joke. Whether it is the writers of this book or the writers of the show itself, basically here's 3 paragraphs saying, look at this stupid symbol, it means nothing, and that's on purpose to intimidate people. It's a really dumb explanation of the symbol, and I don't know where it came from, but there you go. Then it talks about how to become members of the Dominion, what kind of stuff the Dominion have. It talks about the worlds you'll encounter in the Gamma Quadrant. So there is some pretty good stuff. One interesting aspect of the founders and of the Gamma Quadrant in particular is that the Herc are a big part of their past. And the Herc are also a big part of the Klingons' past. They were this big, nasty race. Star Trek Online has depicted them as insects. They're the only Star Trek anything to depict them. So it is non-canonical, but they've been depicted as insectile somethings who kind of ravaged and almost destroyed the Klingons, and then the Klingons rose up and said, no one will ever beat us up again. and then they left and somehow got to the Gamma Quadrant, and they ravaged and almost destroyed the Founders, and then the Founders rose up and said, we will never be picked on again. So it's the same kind of thing. Actually, I think they did the Founders first and then the Klingons. But however it worked, the Hur'q are a big part, which is interesting. So more places, interesting things to visit. Let's skip through all of this stuff and get to the next section, which is the Gamma Quadrant itself. Oh, Dominion allies. Who are the Dominion's allies in the Alpha Quadrant as part of the Dominion War? Well, notably the Cardassians. And, of course, the Breen became these incredibly powerful allies of Cardassia. One of the interesting things about Deep Space Nine, while we're talking about Cardassia, the show in season 4, that's when they brought in the Klingons. And the Klingons were like, oh, hey, we need to be a big part of your show now. And so we get all this interesting Klingon stuff. And the Klingons fought with the Cardassians. And then Cardassia was kind of falling apart. It didn't necessarily lose the war against the Klingons, but it was sorely taxed by that war. And so the Dominion was able to step in and say, hey, we can help you out. We can help you rebuild, and became the first major species to throw in and join the Dominion in the Alpha Quadrant. And, same thing all these other species had done in the Gamma Quadrant. Now they're doing the same thing again in the Alpha Quadrant as the Dominion strives to take over. The Breen were like an ice-based species, or a very cold species that required environmental suits or they would overheat because their home world was so cold. And they had interesting stuff. The Sona were the bad guys in Star Trek Insurrection, that movie, which I actually liked a lot, even though it was not very good. But they started manufacturing Ketracel White to keep the Jem'Hadar in line and provide the Dominion a good source of that in the Alpha Quadrant. So they joined the Dominion, which is why they're in this book. And we get more talking about them. This the Orions kind of didn't really join them, but were there. The Kazin Patriarchy kind of sort of joined them. The Kazin are the cat people. If you're watching Lower Decks, which you should, because Star Trek Lower Decks is fantastic, their medical officer is a Kazin. The Pakleds, they joined the Dominion. Lots of different people joined the Dominion, and hooray for all of that. The Tholians did not, but they had like a mutual non-aggression treaty with them. Same with the Gorn, which is funky because the Gorn were like all the way on the other side of the Klingons. So I don't know how they got there. Anyway, we can skip through a lot of this stuff. But anyway, if you do want to play through the Dominion War, this is invaluable information. Who are the Dominion's allies? Who are their distinct enemies? Who are their maybe allies? All of this stuff is really awesome and cool. So anyway, let's get into the Dominion War itself. This section goes through in extensive detail the entire history of the Dominion War between the Gamma Quadrant and the Alpha Quadrant, starting from the time when it was a Cold War and we didn't know we were even fighting it, to when we first realized, oh wait, there's changelings, oh wait, they've taken over a lot of the leaders of Federation and of Starfleet and of Klingon Empire, and even the Romulan Empire turned out to be changelings in disguise. It did not take them long to completely, infiltrate the Alpha and the Beta Quadrants. And so you get this whole Cold War section, and then it heats up. And then the Klingons start fighting the Cardassians, which is all part of that plan of destabilization as the Dominion was trying to weaken us by getting us to attack each other. And it worked in the case of the Klingons, in case of the Cardassians, because they eventually joined the Dominion. And then we get the Federation Klingon War, and then the Dominion moves in for real, and the war heats up, and we get all this stuff, and then it turns into open war, and things go bad and things go terrible, and there's all this information, and the timeline takes us up to what is essentially the end of Season 6 of Deep Space Nine, which is an advancement of the timeline from where the rest of the books take place. For some reason, Star Trek Adventures it takes place kind of in the later seasons of Next Gen, and so this advances that a few years if you intend to do it. I think it is entirely possible for the most part to play this game without worrying about what year you're in, as long as everybody is aware of like, oh, this is, you know, right here. You can not be a Cardassian Starfleet officer because they're not friends yet, or however you decide that you're going to work that out. Um, I typically always play it post Voyager, post Nemesis, and make up my own stuff. But if you want to play the Dominion War, you can, because they give you all the information and all of the timeline stuff. So here's the current state of the war, and then they even have, advice for how to create characters who have lived through the war or who fought in the war. How do you push forward if you're going to play the end of the Dominion War? The setting is kind of the end of season 6 of Deep Space Nine, but here's all the information, all the stuff that happened in season 7, so you can carry this forward, and you get the Cardassian Rebellion, and you get all these other things. And there's a lot of really good historical detail there. Anyway, time for this. This is the character creation chapter. And it talks about mixed heritage characters and, the kind of specific details of, well, if you want to be half Vorta and half human, how does that even work? What does that even mean? I don't know if that's even possible. Anyway, some of these, like the Argrathi, you might not even remember who they are because they were not interesting or important. Some of them, like the Changelings, you absolutely will. If you want to play a Changeling, whether you are a founder or whether you were a cast-off like Odo, or however you want to work that out, here's the full rules of being a Changeling, including a little description here of, don't let this get out of hand, make sure that you're playing it right, that you're following the rules, that you're using the right restrictions, because a character who can ignore the conservation of mass and change into anything they want automatically, amazingly, can unbalance a campaign if you're not ready for it. So, the Dosi that I talked about, here we go. There's the Dry, there's the Karema. I wish there were illustrations for more of these. And this is a kind of a problem here, and it's a bigger problem, I feel, in the ship section. There should be more art. I shouldn't have to go, what the hell is Allurian, and look it up on Google. It should just be here in the book. Because we want to know what these things look like. Anyway, this, as you can see, is absolutely extensive. I wasn't counting. Let's count really quick so we can see how many species are in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 new player species, which is impressive. Especially one of them is the Tosk, which, according to the lore, the Tosk aren't even like fully sentient. They have enough knowledge to not let themselves be caught in order to make the hunt exciting, but they aren't really free thinking. And so it's interesting that they offer them as a player race. The Wadi, by the way, one of the very worst episodes of all of Deep Space Nine is in season 1. The very first Dominion species that comes through and is like, hey, check out our great culture. They've got a board game that like sucks you inside of it, and then you've got, Kira and Cisco kind of jumping along through this board game, pretending they're board game pieces. It's one of the dumbest episodes, but as a player species, they're kind of interesting. So there we go. Then we get into the starship section, which, like I said, also suffers from a lack of illustration. So you want to be a Jem'Hadar battleship? Well, too bad this picture is actually the Jem'Hadar fighters. We are not going to show you what a Jem'Hadar battleship looks like. Here's a Karema cruiser. What does that look like? I have no idea. Vorta Explorer. What does that look like? Maybe that thing, unless that's a Sona flagship. I don't know. There's a lot of really good stats in here. And I am glad that it's there. But there needs to be more art. You need to show us what all these things look like. Then we get to Starships of the Dominion War. This is specifics. This is not just, a Galaxy class starship, which we already have the rules for. This is the USS Galaxy with all of its very specific information. Here is the USS Prometheus. Here is the Sutherland, which was one of the very famous Nebula class ships. that was used in Next Gen and in Deep Space Nine. Sutherland showed up a lot. So these are interesting because they are not ship templates that you can take and use, because for the most part we already have this. We have rules for Excelsior class ships in other supplements. This is the Lakota itself and its own, very specific eccentricities. So these are like the sample character versions of starships. I wish we had more art for them, but honestly, these are mostly pretty famous, and you can look them up online. And then we get into even some Klingon and some Romulan ships. And then it has rules for the Frankenstein fleet, which is the best part of the whole ship section, in my opinion. What this refers to is when the Dominion War really got moving and Federation realized we don't have the resources that we need to fight this war. They basically pulled a bunch of ships out of mothball and said, well, this thing was so damaged we didn't think it was worth our time to rebuild it. Now we have to. And it is going to be cheaper to fix this broken one than to build a new one. And so they would take all these different ships that had been mothballed, that had been decommissioned, and they would take all the parts that worked and stick them together. And so what you can do with the rules for the Frankenstein fleet, if you're creating a ship for your players or a ship that your players are going to come up against, it's kind of the same thing as the rules for mixed species characters, where you take a primary species, but then you dump one of the talents, one of the traits that you don't get. And then you get a secondary species, and you take one of their traits to patch that hole. And so, for example, the example that they use in this section is a ship that's an old Constitution class, which are super old. That's original series technology. And then they take it and they have given it the warp core and the nacelles from an Intrepid class ship, which is what Voyager is. And so it's this kind of old, durable ship that has this really fancy new engine on it. And so it has a bunch of different traits, and it kind of looks like a cobbled together Frankenstein-y ship. This is a really nice, flavorful way of depicting what the Dominion War was like and the kinds of things that the Federation had to do, and could be a really fun option for a character group that's like, we've got one of these ships. It was built for the Dominion War. Whether you're playing in or after the Dominion War, you could have this weird ship that's 2 or 3 other kinds of ships all cobbled together. And that's a really fun thing, I think. All right, encounters and adversaries. So what is it like? We get a bunch of description here of like the different things that you could run into dealing with the Gamma Quadrant. Why are the prophets, the orbs of the prophets, why are they in the Gamma Quadrant book instead of the Alpha Quadrant book? I have no idea. Here's the Gamma Quadrant. What is it like over there? Here's a bunch of what are essentially just adventure ideas, different things that you could do, and then we get into all the NPCs. So, different Jem'Hadar that you can tangle with, different Vorta that you can tangle with, Dry and Tosk that you can tangle with, all of these other things, and then we get into actual what is it like, how could you construct a campaign around the Dominion War. This is really good information. They have different types of campaigns. Here's the Stellar campaign where you're flying around, very next-gen style, but during the war. Here's an intrigue-based campaign, a political campaign, the absolute in-the-trenches war campaign, the fighting on the side of the Dominion campaign. There's a lot of cool ideas in here, and I really love this whole section. If you want to play a game that uses the Dominion and or the Dominion War, this chapter is going to help give you all the ideas you need of how you can structure that and what are the kinds of things, the kinds of adventures and scenarios to throw against your players. So here are some, different types of Dominion encounters, how to make the Dominion into a credible threat that your players don't want to run into unless they have to. And then we get more NPCs. There's General Martok. There's Kai Wynn. Everyone hates Kai Wynn. Gul Dukat, arguably the best villain of all of Star Trek. Wei Yun, everyone loves Wei Yun. Founder, leader, tons of rules for that. And that's the end of the book. So, hooray! As you can tell, I feel very deeply about the Gamma Quadrant and the Dominion War and Deep Space Nine. Um, I really like this book. It does a really good job of taking one of my favorite corners of the Star Trek mythos and bringing it out so that you can use it in your games. And whether you are going to play the Dominion War or whether you are going to be post or pre Dominion War or however you're going to use it, here's all the information you need about the Dominion. Not as much exploration of the Gamma Quadrant as I would have liked, but what is here is wonderful, and I really dig it, and I am excited to get the opportunity to do a whole Dominion War campaign, and I think that would be super fun. Anyway, hooray for this! The Gamma Quadrant book for Star Trek Adventures is awesome. Definitely go check this out. Grab a copy for yourself and all your friends. I am Dan Wells, and you are awesome.